You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, a.k.a. Mali Docuvixen, and Norman Richmond, a.k.a. Jalali. Joining us on the line from Houston, Texas, is Dr. Gerald Horne.
I'm here.
Yeah, you're on the line. And Dr. Horne is the author of about over 40 books, and his current volume is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. And Dr. Horne, how are you feeling today?
Hey, it's all good. What about you?
Sam Cooke would say, wonderful. I'm good, no problem. Feeling real good. I guess the first question we wanted to ask you is, there is a summit between the leaders of Russia and China, Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi. How do you pronounce the leader of China's name? Yi?
Ping.
Ping. The summit, and do you see this as the New World Order in motion? Am I correct in saying that, or am I wrong?
No, that's highly possible. Particularly pay attention to the nation formerly known as Turkey, which is the eastern flank of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, now waging a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. That includes Canada. Turkey has been a candidate to be a member of the European Union since 1999, which means that it's basically a nullity, that it probably won't be accepted, which is quite unusual. So I mentioned Turkey, because it now is trying to join the SCO. And recall that in the summer of 2016, there was an attempted coup in Turkey, and President Erdogan blamed the United States quite rightly. And I think that there'll probably be another attempted coup, I'm afraid to say, because Turkey also is probably going to try to seek some sort of reconciliation with Syria, its neighbor, which it had been in de facto war with for years now. And so, as the racists say in the United States of America, President Erdogan is off the reservation. And that means that he probably is going to be slated for some sort of elimination. Watch this space. But China and Russia are clearly driving international events. The Financial Times of London reported the other day that China supplies more capital to nations than the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. We're talking about one nation. We're not talking about BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And meanwhile, you see that there's a kind of deindustrialization taking place in Germany and in Europe, because they cut off their nose to spite their face by cutting off energy from Russia. There are going to be people freezing in the dark in coming months in Europe. And in fact, I understand, and you heard it here first, that a song by Teddy Pendergrass is going to be the new anthem for Europe. What is that song?
I have no idea.
Did you hear that?
No, sir.
Oh, turn off the lights, light a candle. In other words,
turn off the lights.
I mean, this is basically what happened, is that the Western Europeans have followed Washington over the cliff. Now, I understand why the United States is trying to destabilize Russia, because if it destabilizes Russia, it forestalls the possibility of the Europeans getting closer to Russia, which was the import of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. And now, with that off the table, the Western Europeans are going to have to buy energy from the United States. But at the same time, it seems that the Europeans have painted themselves into a corner. And there are those who are suggesting that this is a turning point for European history. That not only will you be seeing the rise of China, but you'll see the precipitous decline of the European nations, led by Germany. And perhaps more ominous of all is that Berlin has decided to rearm. Those of us who have a memory of World War II feel that we've seen this movie before. We realize how bloody and bloodily efficient this German army was, and now we're headed down that same path again. It's quite dangerous.
Well, we just had an interview with Charles Simmons about Abdul Rahman Mohammed Babu, and one of the things that Babu pointed out when he used to talk was that before the U.S. imperialists move on anyone, they villainize the leader of that country. So they have begun to villainize Erdogan of Turkey. Am I correct in saying that?
Oh yeah, I mean that's been happening for a while. As you know, his major opponent lives in Pennsylvania, and
yes.
The United States refuses to extradite him. I'm talking about Fethullah Gulen, who I've mentioned many times before, is close to the Black community insofar as he's opened a number of charter schools in Black communities from the Atlantic to the Pacific, also in Houston, Texas, by the way. And speaking of Houston, Texas, a number of the liquefied natural gas facilities that will be trying to export to Europe are located in this vicinity. There have been a number of very curious explosions in these facilities in recent days and weeks, which does not bode well for the safety of individuals in this neck of the woods.
And you are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Dr. Gerald Horne and Melinda Francis. You have a question, Melinda?
So did we want to go to, I don't know, the South Africa-U.S. summit at the White House?
Yeah, President Ramaphosa came to Washington. He's en route to New York for the General Assembly of the United Nations, which will be opening. It bids fair to be a very historic event. I'm sure that Mr. Biden will unload on Russia, probably China too. But President Ramaphosa, it's very interesting. Washington is trying to put the screws to South Africa. They're upset with the fact that South Africa won't go along with the sanctions crusade against Moscow. And this meeting was designed to put pressure on President Ramaphosa. And I should also say, I might have mentioned this before, but I'll say it again, that South Africa post-1994 was guaranteed to have a rocky road. And some of it has to do with the Gorbachev regime, which, as a result of its negotiations with Washington, decided to pull the plug on support for national liberation movements. And it's no accident that the apartheid authorities chose to negotiate with their opponents a few weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall. That is when Nelson Mandela was unbanned and freed. And since that time, you've had a domestic constituency in South Africa that collaborates with U.S. imperialism. And at the same time, you have a Black American constituency, which does not understand a whit about international politics, and in some ways has become an objective ally on U.S. imperialism, be it with regard to South Africa policy, China policy, Russia policy. The only difference is they usually come up with a different rationale. I mean, usually the rationale is for an opponent of U.S. imperialism that they're racist. And they can't say that about South Africa. So it's interesting to sort of tease out what the basis of their opposition there is.
What is their opposition to? What is the opposition? What have you been reading and hearing?
Well, I think it's just like Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe moved towards land reform. It led to sanctions against that nation. And many Black Americans did not stand with the ZANU-PF government. They opposed the ZANU-PF government. The rationale there was human rights violations. That's why they did not stand with Zimbabwe on land reform. With regard to South Africa, the opposition there has a scintilla of accuracy, but as I mentioned a moment or two ago, it fails to take into account all of the underlying conditions. The rationale being that the South Africans have not moved rapidly enough to redistribute the wealth. Now, we're talking about a country of less than 55 million, a middle-ranking power with about the size of the economy of the Netherlands, that had the rug pulled out from under it when Gorbachev decided to get in bed with Reagan. And as I said, I mean, and then many of these people didn't support the ANC anyway during the course of the struggle. Most of them supported the PAC. I remember having arguments with people during that time before elections. They were telling me the PAC was going to win, and then they got in the low single digits. So, you know, these people are sort of out of it anyway.
But I remember I supported the PAC until they killed David Sobukwe. And David Sobukwe, beg your pardon?
David Sobeko.
Sobeko. Elizabeth Sobeko, that's his wife. I think she's still in the land of the living. But anyway, David Sobeko used to come to I guess he was based in New York, and Ilombe Brath was a supporter of the PAC. Independent of him, I was a supporter of the PAC, but when they killed Mr. Pronounce his name one more time.
Sobeko, Sibeko.
Sobeko, David Sobeko. Ilombe went with the ANC, and later on, I remember I went with the ANC because David was had nothing to do with his personality, but you know the PAC was basically a lot of them were anti-communist. I guess he had like a united front, and there was an element in the PAC that was they were to put it mildly, they were pretty out to lunch.
Well, that's described at length, what you talk about in my book, White Supremacy Confronted. Also described at length is what happened in Tanzania back at the day when President Nyerere found it necessary to arrest and detain a number of Black Americans because he thought that they were smuggling weapons that were destined for UNITA in Angola, except that the Tanzanians thought that they were also destined to overthrow their regime as well. I mean, these Black Americans, as I said, one of the problems with the Black Americans is they take all these out-to-lunch positions and then they walk away from them and don't analyze it, don't try to find out where they went wrong, and they just stumble from out-to-lunch position to out-to-lunch position.
Some people supported Savimbi, I guess. Savimbi from UNITA. That was UNITA was basically a CIA and a Portuguese fascism front, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and the Black Americans were accused of trying to smuggle weapons. Because there were hundreds of Black Americans in Tanzania at the time. This is in the 1970s. Some of that has been written about in book form, although there's much more to be said. And as I said, for those looking for further details, look no further than the book I wrote, White Supremacy Confronted.
The last question on that was O'Neill, the brother from, I think he's from Kansas City, Panther. He and his wife are still in Tanzania now. Was he part of that group? I hope not.
I don't know. I interviewed the author of a book about Pete O'Neill and Charlotte O'Neill of Tanzania via Kansas City on kpfk.org. You can find it in the archives. I interviewed them a few weeks ago. And speaking of which, that show, Freedom Now, it's 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. If I must say so myself, it's probably one of the most informative programs in the Pan-African community. And I say that in part because we covered all the bases. And I say that also with a certain humility because there are so many podcasts out here nowadays. It seems like everybody and their mama has a podcast. Yet I still think that freedom now is outstripping them all.
Mm-hmm. Melinda, did you have a question?
Did we want to talk about the death of the Queen?
The death of the parasite, number one. Obviously, you remember Jackie Moms Mabley, I'm sure, and her
I remember. Yes.
From her father, who said, when somebody dies, if you can't say anything good about them, don't say anything. And so Moms Mabley would say, okay, the Queen died, good. And I mean, look, here's a woman who's sitting on the wealth stolen from Africa and the Caribbean, heading a government that's been involved in regime change. And by the way, here's a special message to our friends in Canada. I know you probably think that the Queen is a figurehead and her representative, the Governor General, is a figurehead. You need look no further than the Grenada invasion of October 1983, facilitated by the Governor General, or the dislodging of the Labour government in Australia in the mid-1970s, memorialized in the film starring Sean Penn, which I recommend, The Falcon and the Snowman, destabilized that Canberra government through the Governor General. So keep your eye on that Governor General in Ottawa, particularly since, as we know, you just had a change of leadership in the Tory party. I think the current leader of the Tory party is a bit more savvy and slippery than previous leaders. And so I'm not sure if you folks are out of the woods yet. And speaking of which, we've been talking about Handmaid's Tale. So that's, of course, the series based on the Margaret Atwood novel. And I went back and looked at the movie on Handmaid's Tale, which came out a few decades ago, with Faye Dunaway and Robert Duvall.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, it's more interesting than this multi-part series that you can find on various platforms. There's one of the distinctions in the movie version that I saw with Dunaway and Duvall was that there's not the rah-rah Canadian patriotism in the Hulu version, and nor are there leading black characters as in the Hulu version. So I'm not sure what to make of that.
Well, you mentioned Sir Paul, the Governor General of Grenada. At that time, he was Sir Paul Coon, Schoon. And I remember he talked about the invasion of Grenada. I think he said something about it being a jolly good event or something to that effect. I mean, he was a real, he was an Anglo-Saxon to the bone. Do you remember him?
I remember him. I also remember that Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher got very upset with her counterpart, Ronald Reagan, because that invasion was pulled off not only behind her back, it was pulled off by the Queen's representative, Her Majesty's representative. Now, I haven't even talked about, of course, shortly after Queen Elizabeth got to office, there was the dislodging of Chitty Jagan in Guyana, stirring up antagonism between South Asian and Africans that exist to this very day. I haven't talked about the so-called Mau Mau revolt in Kenya, where there was mass detentions, concentration camps, castrations. I haven't talked about the fact in terms of there being parasites. And as I've said on a number of platforms this week, you probably need to invite on a parasitologist, a scientist who studies parasites, in order to really understand this royal family, because they're untaxed. They sit up on billions of dollars in fortune, although the ultimate size of their fortune is a state secret. They may be the wealthiest landlords on planet Earth, and yet that regime continues. Now, I understand to a degree why it continues in Canada. In the 19th century, Ottawa felt that they needed London as backup because the United States was always trying to invade.
Right.
I don't think in the 21st century that that's a real fear, although maybe I'm wrong.
Didn't the Queen go to Kenya? Was it in 1952? Am I correct in saying that?
Well, I know she was in South Africa, race of South Africa. I don't know if it was post 1948. And I know she was in Kenya. Yeah, she was in Kenya during the emergencies, as it was euphemistically called.
That's when the Land and Freedom Army, the so-called Mau Maus, were they were a thorn in British imperialism, colonialism side at that point. I believe I'm right in saying that.
Oh, I think that's a fair assessment. And speaking of which, I think we can announce finally that William Ruto has been officially declared the incoming leader in Nairobi, Kenya, after a microscopically small victory over Raila Odinga. And let's hope that the Kenyans can sort out their internal problems.
Could you talk about, Kwame Nkrumah maintained that there was no problem with tribes. The problem is with tribalism. How is the tribalism situation in Kenya in 2022?
Well, it's still complicated. If I'm not mistaken, Odinga is Luo. And
yes.
The joke in Kenya, particularly after Obama, who is, of course, of partial Luo ancestry, the joke in Nairobi was that a Luo would be elected president of the United States before not president of Kenya. It turns out that was true. It was sort of an upset that Odinga lost because the then incumbent who had been in conflict with Uhuru Kenyatta had turned against his vice president, Mr. Ruto, and made a handshake deal with Odinga. But that was not enough to push him across the finish line.
Yeah, our late comrade Anyango Olo, he was a Luo, and he used to be with us on CKLN and on many platforms. And I think Anyango Olo was in prison with Maina Kenyatta. Maina Kenyatta, I think he's still in the land of the living, but he was an expert on the Mau Maus, I believe. Have you ever met Maina Kenyatta?
Doesn't ring a bell.
Well, he's an expert. Well, you might just put him in a Google search. He's an expert on the Mau Mau, and he used to teach us Swahili. Not us, but he taught Swahili in Detroit in a library there. You have another question, Melinda?
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the tensions between Mali and the Ivory Coast?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. These are neighboring West African countries. We know that Mali has been in conflict with France, particularly after it asked the French to leave their country. And Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, is quite close to Paris. So what happens is that somehow some troops from Côte d'Ivoire, a few dozen, landed in Mali. The Malians said that they were uninvited. And then what happens is that they've been detained. And since that detention, tensions have been rising between the two countries. Now, I know that France would like to get rid of the Malian regime. In fact, the United States would too, because the Malian regime has also gotten close to Russia, which of course is seen as sort of the mark of the devil. So it's a very complicated and tension-filled relationship right now.
Now, Mali has a history of being to the left. Ivory Coast or Côte d'Ivoire is the home of Ugo. I forgot the brothers. I'm having a senior moment. He is Blaise Compaoré, who was implicated in the death of Thomas Sankara. Blaise Compaoré married Houphouët-Boigny, Houphouët-Boigny's daughter, and Mali has a history of, I guess, Modibo Keita, and Mali has more of a history of after independence of being more to the left of Ivory Coast. Would you say that's correct?
Well, I think that's correct. But, being to the left of Cote d'Ivoire is not saying that much.
As Sam Cooke would say, no retort at all. You're right. I don't even know why I made that statement.
Mm-hmm.
You have a question, Melinda?
Do you want to talk about Greece and Turkey tensions?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate that we end up where we began, because just as we began talking about the conflict between President Erdogan and the North Atlantic Bloc, coincidentally enough, tensions are rising between Turkey and Greece over certain islands that are Greek territory but are closer to Turkish territory. Over the decades, for quite a while, Greece, which has a population of about 9 million, has really been battered from pillar to post by Turkey, which has a population of about 82 million. In fact, about 200 years ago, there was a very bitter independence struggle fought by Greece against the Turks, and of course, it takes on a religious cast. And you can't really talk about European politics without talking about religion, since Greece is predominantly Christian and therefore has attracted the attention and the support of France, predominantly Catholic, and Turkey, as you know, is predominantly Muslim. You see the same thing right now in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia, predominantly Christian, bills itself as one of the first predominantly Christian nations on planet Earth, in conflict with predominantly Muslim Azerbaijan, supported by the Turks. Interestingly enough, as we speak, Speaker Nancy Pelosi is in Armenia, giving support to the Armenians. And that also raises a point about your comrade, Kanye West, who quite infamously, when asked about slavery of African Americans, said that it was a choice. And then, of course, he married an Armenian American, speaking of Kim Kardashian, and spent a lot of time in Armenia. Armenia, of course, was subjected to genocide by the Turks approximately 105 years ago. I never heard Kanye say a mumbling word about whether the genocide against the Armenians was a choice, which says a mouthful.
I guess we have run out of time, but before we close, I just wanted to say that I've been watching the Munich track and field, the track meet from Munich, the European track meet, and the Great Britain team looked like their relay team looked like, all of them looked like Wesley Snipes. Turkey had 2 Euros and two Africans that looked like Wesley Snipes. Israel had I think the anchorman looked like Wesley Snipes, and Ireland, the Netherlands, it was Germany. It was I couldn't believe it in terms of what imperialism has deposited African people, I guess, all over the world.
Not only that, but we're so accustomed, we get so much practice in running from the police, but then it bleeds over into the sprint.
Okay. So it's not just the Jamaican food. It's the police have a lot to do with it.
Oh yeah, I think it's the culture. It reminds me of this academic in the United States who's, you always have to explain when Black Americans do well. So if you're trying to explain why Black Americans do well in sprints, and so he said, it's because of our thighs and muscles. And then you say, well, damn, why aren't the Angolans doing better in sprints? Why aren't some of these West Africans? We're all the same people. And of course, what he forgot to mention was that, for example, if you look at why Jamaicans have done so well in sprints, a lot of it's mass participation. I mean, it's a big deal in Jamaica from the time of the youth of Jamaican nationals through young adulthood to participate in track and field. And I think that's the ultimate explanation. That is to say, mass participation in culture.
I would agree, because even in Los Angeles, California, we had a coach named Mr. Adams, and from middle school, so-called middle school or junior high school, we had track meets, and when we had these track meets, and the stands would be packed with beautiful women, and a lot of guys, including myself, used to love to run that track because they hit that tape. To hear the girls scream and all of that, that was a big motivating factor. And I was pretty dangerous when it came to 50 yards. Now, what happened after 50 yards was another situation. But and then they dropped all of, like at Fremont, they don't even have I don't even think we have a track team at John C. Fremont anymore.
Oh, that's terrible.
And in the track in the stadium is named after I guess Ricky Bell. That's Archie Bell's brother. The stadium is named after him. We talked about that a couple of times, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So is there anything else you'd like to add, sir?
No, time to sign off.
Thank you very much, and we will be back in touch with you next week.
Good luck.
And anything you'd like to say, Melinda?